There is a thing beneath the woods and the worms with grave intent. A thing that my grandfather called Paskuda, when he dared to speak its name. That was long ago, of course, before we left Poland, which now feels like an alien place from an alien time. I was 4 when we moved away, and I barely remember my life before that. Like damp clay, young minds are so easily reshaped, or misshapen. It did not take long for me to view England as my home, and I chose to believe that my Polish self had never existed. I chose to forget. Upon learning of Paskuda, most choose the same fate. It is easier than bearing the burden. I was a terrified tot when Grandpa first filled my head with that darkness, but age hasn't helped to digest the unsettling story in my gut. It hasn't cleansed my mind of awful childhood memories. Predominantly, memories of my grandfather cautioning me about the forest and the thing that lived there. Nights on which I'd weep through my thin pillow cover. Pay no mind to his ghost stories, Adet. He comes from a different time, Dad used to say. My parents were the same with me. It's a generational thing. But my mother, Grandpa's own daughter, would defend me. She chastised her father for the stories he told, whether facts or fiction. It wasn't right to scare a child. That was what she reminded him. My mother wanted to shield me. Still, she never asked for the details about the things he would say, only ever told him to stop. I often wonder whether she, too, endured Grandpa's awful tales of the thing below. It all started with childhood curiosity, a blessing and a curse. Before my grandfather told me about Paskuda, he frequently forbade me from entering the nearby forest. That made me unpopular with friends, as they often wanted to play in the woods after school. But I obeyed Grandpa. In return, however, I begged him to at least explain why I must avoid the forest. After enduring months of my incessant nagging, he eventually obliged. I wish he hadn't. It seems wrong that I was punished for my curiosity. It's the very nature of being human. Children long to have their minds opened by those wiser or more experienced. And when it's a safe person, a child asks every question imaginable, because the wise storyteller is trusted. We know that our loved ones, by design, do not break us. My grandfather broke that cardinal rule. It found me in Stawishan when I was a boy, Grandpa said. And no matter where I go, it follows. What follows, Grandpa? I asked. Paskuda, he replied with a gravelly tone. That word means so many things. My grandfather may well have been talking about some bungling buffoon he'd seen in the woods, but I knew that wasn't what he meant. It is context that defines a word, and Grandpa's voice said it all. I inferred the meaning from his tone. Evil. That was not enough, of course. It raised only more questions. I had no idea what it meant to be followed by evil. What is Paskuda, Grandpa? I asked. The man grumbled, eyeing the window in fear. It's as Pandora's box, in a way. Some have it, some don't. If you do, you mustn't ever open it. I surveyed the old man with puzzlement. To a 4-year-old girl, those words meant nothing. Then again, those words may be equally perplexing to anyone who has not experienced Paskuda. It was only with awful experience that I started to appreciate the significance of Grandpa's words. His cautionary tale now weighs heavily on my spirit. My grandfather seemed to notice my confused expression. "Do you ever feel sad, Odette?" "Yes," I shrugged. Grandpa eyed me for a second, then sighed. "When a toy breaks, or you don't get what you want." I nodded, disheartened that I seemed to be disappointing my grandfather. I didn't understand the vast majority of what he was saying. Nevertheless, I was reaching the age at which I could read people's emotions, so I did sense that my grandfather was frustrated. He was desperately trying to communicate with me, but my vocabulary was limited. It is a wonder that he didn't seem to think about that, even for a moment. Didn't seem to realise that his story was not suitable for a child. "Yes, that is sadness," Grandpa nodded, continuing. "But there is another form of sadness, one deeper and darker, one not born of reason, but illness. And I pray, Odette, that you never understand what I mean. Your mother was fortunate not to inherit my disease, not to understand how I feel, but sometimes I see the way you look at the world, Odette, and it scares me." "Don't be scared, Grandpa," I said, still not comprehending. The man frowned for a second, and his brow sported a few additional folds that rested atop one another. Then he allowed the stack of skin to smoothen. With a relaxed expression once more, my grandfather offered a plain smile, one that even a 4-year-old could see was disingenuous. "I'm not worried, Odette." That isn't what I meant," he chuckled. "Okay. You still haven't told me about Paskuda," I huffed. "I have," the man answered softly. "But I should stop there, Odette. I don't know why I told you any of this. You're too young." "I'm not," I gasped, as all children do when being told such a thing. "I'm a grown-up." Grandpa smiled. "I was young too, when it all started. That is why, in spite of your youth, I believe I have a responsibility to prepare you." I shuffled around on the carpet uncomfortably, disliking Grandpa's tone, though I didn't know why I disliked it. I knew I regretted asking him about Paskuda, but I didn't want to appear too afraid to hear his tale. I said nothing, letting the old man speak. "In 1950, I was 6 years old," my grandfather said, eyeing the window again. "Stavishon was a good town, a proud town. I was happy, until the feelings arrived." "The bad ones?" I asked. He nodded. "The ones that still make your grandpa a little blue sometimes, Odette." "Mummy said that's why you take the medicine," I said. "Yes, Odette. That's why I take the medicine," my grandfather nodded. "But I didn't take it when I was young. It was a very different world. People with illnesses like mine weren't helped like people in the modern world." "Does it hurt, Grandpa?" I asked, lip quivering. "What?" "Being ill all of the time," I said. Grandpa smiled. "It's not that kind of illness, Odette. It's not the flu. It's... You're still too young to understand. I was the same. I started to feel different around the age of 6, but I hid it from my parents. I thought I'd been possessed. thought something had infected my soul. Above all else, I feared for my place in society. Men were supposed to be strong, and the thoughts that were filling my head, those were the thoughts of a weak man. At least that was what I supposed they would say about me. "I don't understand," I said. "I know, Odette," he replied. You're so young. But the darkness doesn't care about that. Paskuda doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about innocence. It doesn't care about what is fair. It just takes and takes. I don't want it to take anything from you, Odette. "You're scaring me, Grandpa," I whimpered. The man's eyes widened. "No, I didn't mean to frighten you. Hush now, hush. No crying. Just let me explain myself. Let me explain what happened to me as a boy, okay? And then you'll understand. You'll never need to be afraid again, because you'll know what not to do. Yes?" I nodded, tightening every muscle in my face to prevent tears from welling in my eyes. I didn't know why I was scared, but as I mentioned, a child doesn't need to understand words to understand meaning. I sensed the sincerity in Grandpa's voice, the fear in his voice. It was contagious. I was walking through the forest near my hometown. "I always tell you never to go in the woods, don't I?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered. "Well, you must heed that warning in all places," Grandpa explained. "You see, it is not that the trees carry any weight, not the soil, not the plants, not the animals. No, it's about the feeling that a forest evokes, Odette. A beautiful place during the day, but at night, not so much." The man paused before sighing. "Paskuda lies in all corners, Odette, but it prefers nooks and crannies, the corners not frequented by people. After all, those are the places that we fear, the places we avoid, the places that make us weak. Not all people, perhaps, but some. And Paskuda strikes only those with a tender disposition." "Like you, Grandpa?" I asked, quivering. He nodded. "Like me, Odette. The vulnerable. I was walking through the forest, and I came upon a ring of twigs placed neatly on the ground. A ring the size of a bicycle wheel. My friends and I would sometimes stroll through that area, so I thought one of them had built it. A smile filled my face, which was a rarity for me at that age, after the sickness took hold. I didn't want to lose that sliver of happiness, so I did it." "Did what?" I asked. My grandfather's smile faded. "I broke the circle, Odette. Swept my shoe through the decoration of branches, then laughed to myself. Afterwards, I noticed something in the muddy clearing at the heart of the shattered circle. The dirt was smooth, oddly smooth, as if it were covering something. And when I toed the mud, pushing the cap of my boot into the dirt, I could tell that the inner circle was hollow. I kept pushing, heart racing, and I almost saw what lay beneath the soil. I was so close, so painfully close, but But what, Grandpa? I squeaked, voice barely audible. Something interrupted me, the man coldly replied. In my peripheral vision, I saw a shape move behind a nearby tree. It was daytime, mind you. This was no trick of shadows at night. I know what I saw. Something moved behind the tree. One of your friends? I hopefully queried. No, Odette, the man answered. Not one of my friends. The shape was far too tall for that. What did you do? I whispered. The same thing that any child would do in that situation, he replied. I ran home. Was it the Paskuda? I asked, hardly wanting an answer. Grandpa ignored the question. Breaking the circle was only the first step. It was the invitation. And I have been pursued for 54 years. Before I broke the ring, the illness had already been burgeoning in the depths of my mind. A sickness like this is innate, no doubt about that, but it can be kept at bay until one chooses to welcome it inside. Never welcome Paskuda, Odette. If you ever find a ring, a circle, in a place like that, just walk away. A ring of sticks? I asked. No, child. It's not about the sticks. It's not about the forest. It's useless. That's what. Telling you all of this, it's useless. You don't understand, and I pray that you never will. Is there more, Grandpa? I asked, still striving to be brave. When did you see Paskuda? When did you learn its name? Name? The man mumbled, raising an eyebrow. That has no name, Odette. I call it Paskuda because it is Paskuda. That's as tangible as it'll ever be. Tangible? What does that mean? I asked. Never mind. I'll finish my story, Odette, Grandpa said. But it'd be better for you to not ask questions. You don't want answers. Not really. If you never understand, enjoy a blessed life. If you do understand, God save you. Will you listen quietly? I nodded weakly. Good, he replied. You mustn't tell your mother what I'm about to tell you. She wouldn't understand. I'm doing it to protect you. I held my breath as Grandpa adjusted himself in his seat. The first step was welcoming the sickness, breaking its sacred ring, my grandfather said. The next step was experiencing loss. That is what happens after the sickness is let inside. It takes something from you. It may be something physical, such as your beloved teddy bear, Odette, the one you lost on holiday last year. Remember? That was loss. Or it may be something that cannot be touched. Do you understand? I nodded again, but the words were nonsensical to my ears. For me, loss came in the form of... Grandpa trembled, seemingly retaining fearful tears. I came home to something vile a week after I broke the circle. A week of feeling watched, as if a shadow were flattening my shoulders, pushing down with such force that it sought to drive me into the ground itself. And then, on a day no different from any other, I saw her. Mother. My mother, I mean. She was dangling from the awning above the front porch, surrounded by neighbours and a police officer. Dangling? I asked. Yes, she... No, I shouldn't explain myself, Odette, my grandfather said. My mother passed away. She died. That's all you need to know. I'm sorry, I timidly replied. It's okay, Odette. You never knew her, and it was my fault. I invited it inside, Grandpa whispered. Losing part of oneself is the second step. Paskuda longs to weaken its prey. It convinces you, much like the devil, that it does not exist at all. That is what makes it truly horrifying. And it is easier for a person to listen that way. You start to believe that you might simply be hearing your own thoughts. Once I believed that, I listened to all of the awful things the voice had to say. Things that had been muted and muffled until I saw my mother's lifeless neck, strangled by that rope. Rope? I asked. I didn't mean... Forget what I said, Odette, he sharply said. The point is that I became sicker, and the voice of Paskuda became louder. A parasitic evil, born only to feed. Are you okay, Grandpa? I shuddered, noting his pale face and manic demeanour. Yes, he nodded, sweating heavily. I'm better now. Things haven't been as bad for the past couple of decades, my child. The pills quieten things, numb me, make me lesser. But that's okay because the medicine makes Paskuda lesser too. Sometimes. I nodded, reminding myself not to ask questions. I'd already forgotten a couple of times, and I didn't want my grandfather to stop telling his story entirely. I won't tell you what it told me, Grandpa whispered. Better I not put any ideas in your head. You want to know whether I saw it, don't you? And the answer is... I don't know. I saw something, but I just don't know. I only know that it's real, Odette. After one horrible night, a few weeks later, I never doubted that again. I sat quietly, tightly compressing my lips to still the questions, itching to wriggle free. I was lying in bed, trying to hush the voice in my head. The nagging, intrusive thoughts, the earworms that had been burrowing into my canals for a month or maybe longer. Maybe long before I even disturbed that ring of twigs in the forest. For I had always been sick, Odette, and something happened to make me accept that, he said. What happened? I asked, clasping my mouth a second too late. My grandfather sighed. I will tell you once, and never again, Odette. Do it. Do it. Do what I say. The voice cried those words tirelessly, and I finally obliged. I stopped ignoring it, stopped fighting the thoughts. I looked at my open doorway, eyeing the thing that had been begging me to pay attention for weeks. I did not hear the creak of a floorboard, not the growl of a predator, not anything. In fact, as the voice in my ears vanished, the pressure released. The voice disappeared because I finally paid attention to it. The old man paused for a few seconds, limbs twitching uncontrollably. Grandpa looked physically ill, though he always explained that his sickness was not anything tangible, something I would understand in later life. "It was watching me from the hallway, Odette," the man eventually said. "What was watching you?" I cried, heart punctured by dread. "Nothing with a name," my grandfather replied. "Paskuda is the title I chose, and even that word feels like ash on my tongue." "Grandpa," I whimpered, tears trickling down my cheeks. I don't know what you mean. What did you see in the hallway?" He bawled too, speaking with a brittle timbre. "It was nothing, Odette. Nothing wearing something. I knew that whatever I saw before me, it was a lie. A physical manifestation of something not physical at all. Something that didn't belong in our world." I sobbed, and Grandpa sighed before shushing me. "Shh. It was a plague, Odette," he continued. "A cancerous bulge of tumour-riddled flesh. Paskuda is not something that can be seen by our eyes. I know that now. It wore the mask of something human eyes could see and understand. It was almost a body, and that revolting appearance was terrifying, but not as terrifying as what hid underneath, what I didn't see. The transparent evil that had been stalking me for months. The thing that still follows, wearing whatever ails me." I didn't respond, not in any way that I remember, and for countless nights after that, I sobbed. From that day forth, during our final months in Poland, Grandpa would only mention Paskuda when issuing warnings. He would tell me to stay away from the forest and circles. Anything that might invite Paskuda into our world, for it had nothing to do with trees, dirt, or worms. It had everything to do with me and the decisions I would make. Grandpa Alexei stopped talking about the faceless, nameless abomination when we started our new lives in England. And when I asked others in my family about his campfire tale, they seemed confused. My younger brother, Anthony, was 2 years old when we moved to England, so he didn't seem to remember any of the tales Grandpa told in Poland. My mother would simply chortle and tell me not to fret about her father's ramblings. He had been a few pennies short of £1 for years. I asked him about the monster again at the age of 8. "Why don't you talk about it anymore, Grandpa?" I asked. "What do you mean, Odette?" the man grumbled, lifting a grey, overgrown brow. "Paskuda," I said. My grandfather smiled at me warmly. The cosy smile he would wear before offering any words of kindness, any words of soothing strength. And that smile disarmed me, as I did not expect the words which gushed out of his curved grin. "If you ever speak of it again, "I will seal those lips," he softly warned. After yelping in terror, I told my mother about Grandpa's threat, and she scolded her father. He was kinder to me after that, and I stopped mentioning Paskuda. That was the unspoken agreement between us. I understood his message, heard him loud and clear, even at such a young age. It was a haunting warning, but that was what I needed. Paskuda was not an evil to be dismissed, but it was also not one to discuss. As the years passed, so did my nightmares, and Paskuda became nothing more than a childhood fable. Something that I was forced to endure, whilst Anthony was spared. And that seemed telling. After all, if the creature were real, if it was something worth fearing and avoiding at all costs, then surely Grandpa would have told my little brother once he'd reached an appropriate age. Then again, my grandfather changed after we moved to England. He retreated inwards, becoming an oddly reserved man. The medicine no longer seemed to help him, and my mother started to worry that old age, rather than his pre-existing mental illness, might be to blame. I turned 24 this year. I've gained 2 decades of experience since Grandpa first told me his tale of terror. Regardless of how foggy that story became in my mind, it lingered. I finally appreciated what my grandfather had been trying to tell me. Finally appreciated that his prediction had come true. I was unwell. Maybe not like him, but it had always been there, at the back of my mind. I knew that my grandfather struggled with severe depression. I learnt that he tried to take his life years before I was born, and that explained so much. My psychological poison has always been anxiety, fear, dread. An innate fear, I should say. One detached from reason. My depression is a byproduct of that. I am not so different from Grandpa. There may be some hereditary nature to my mental illness. He certainly thought so when I was a child. Anxiety, depression. Labels, labels, labels. We all want to colour coordinate our grey matter, as if that does anything to organise it. Wisely, I chose not to follow Grandpa's dated advice about suppressing psychological problems. Over the years, I confronted my illness. I didn't directly address my irrational fears, admittedly, but I pushed myself out of my comfort zone. My family members and friends were shocked by my decision to pursue a career as a firefighter. Nonetheless, after an apprenticeship and years of training, my dream came true. 6 months ago, I became a firefighter, and I believed that I'd found the cure to fear. After facing real-world danger, intrusive thoughts would seem inconsequential. That logic seemed sound to me, though it would quickly disintegrate. Still, I'd made something of myself, become more of a person in my eyes. That was my illness talking, of course, but I will say that this line of work has improved me in so many ways. It is a dangerous vocation, but one that has transformed my body and my soul. There is no denying, of course, that I simply found a dressing for a festering wound. Last month, we responded to a fire at a multi-storey block of apartments in the city centre. A resident named Darius Havisham had a stroke, leaving his stove unattended, and the flames spread before anybody knew what was happening. He was nothing but a charred corpse when we arrived, but there were others, unharmed, who were still trapped in the building. Our team had 5 floors to sweep. It was not the tallest block of flats in the city, by any stretch of the imagination, but still a huge area to cover in a short window of time. When we reached the top floor, my mind wasn't entirely there. Seeing the corpse of Darius Havisham, roasted beyond recognition, had fractured something within me. I'd been working as a firefighter for 5 months at that point, and his body was the first truly horrific thing I'd seen. The first corpse I'd seen. It personified the inferno. The fire had devoured the man's flesh and stripped him down to bones. Those flames seemed sinister somehow. Terrified me as I realised that for months I'd been walking through hellscapes. The fire licked at my suit with egregious intent, rather than being swayed by an unthinking breeze. It lived, and it was cruel. I barely heard the words of my colleague as we scoured apartment 511.
Odette!
Diego repeated. What? I panted into my amplified facepiece.
The kitchen?
He shouted back. Yes, I breathlessly replied. All clear.
Me, lounge. You, bedroom.
He barked in brief, clear orders, nodding at the room I needed to explore. I rushed towards the door and barged it inwards with a sturdy shoulder. It didn't require much force, of course, as flames had weakened the wood. Upon entering the bedroom, I immediately saw her. The sobbing girl on the bed. "Resident!" I yelled. "Requesting assistance!"
Fire!
Diego yelled something inaudible in return, and footsteps followed from the hallway beyond the apartment as other firefighters approached. I barely registered any of that, however, as I focused on the fire's behaviour. I am not a seasoned professional in my city's fire department. However, I know, much like the average Joe, how flames naturally act. And there was no reason for the fire to have moved outwards from the centre of the room, forming a circular clearing in the centre. Without ceremony, that clearing began to darken. There appeared a smooth, blackened mass in the cleared core of the fiery ring.
Diego!
I yelled.
Assistance!
I'm cut off, Odette!
Diego cried.
All units, assistance in apartment 511.
I eyed the black clearing in fear. The circle that even the flames, which had horrified me moments earlier, seemed to fear. Seemed to avoid like cursed land. The blackened carpet looked like a hole, though the floor had not disappeared. It felt wrong to my eyes, as if I was seeing something that shouldn't be seen. Something that certainly shouldn't be touched. My finger lightly rested on the trigger to my extinguisher, paralysed by a subconscious compartment of my mind. Some self-preserving instinct. And the girl on the bed appeared to feel the same way. She was quivering on her mattress, unwilling to move towards me. She viewed the black clearing as a whole too. I could see that in her eyes. It was a chasm 4 feet in diameter, but for a girl around 10 years old, it might as well have been a canyon.
What's your name?
I loudly asked. The girl responded, but I didn't hear her over the radio chatter and crackling flames. Didn't hear her over the hole, which seemed to call in some soundless way. Called with deafening silence. I wished I could see either the carpet or the apartment beneath the black mass. Something natural, physical, real. Yet I saw only blackness, though I was convinced that something might be hiding within.
Odette!
Gary yelled. The third firefighter burst into the flat, standing in apartment 511's main hallway, with eyes flitting between the bedroom and the end of the corridor.
Diego, you stuck?
Gary asked.
Extinguisher broken. Help Odette.
Diego shouted in return. Gary ignored the request and began to extinguish the hallway fire with his equipment, creating a safe passage for Diego to reach the two of us.
Damn it, Gary!
Diego growled.
Odette, Odette!
Gary yelled. The longer I eyed the blackness before me, the sicker I felt. I could have waited for Gary and Diego to enter the room. Could have consulted with them. Should have, most certainly, left the fiery ring alone. Grandpa's words rang distantly in my mind. His story of the unearthly circle in the forest. His warning to steer clear of such things. However, I never would have been able to live with the thought of abandoning a child in a burning room. Even if I'd somehow explained it to my colleagues, that girl's face would have haunted me until my dying day. I sensed the horror of the circle. I felt the urge to run. But why fight to survive if I'd spend the rest of my life suffering? That was why I lunged forwards. My suit was singed by the barrier of flames, breaking the circle as my boot landed on the black floor within the clearing. The only foundation that felt steady in the entire building. Everywhere else, the floor had been decaying, but that black clearing felt almost fixed, immovable. Yet, as I raced through the circle, I remained convinced that the darkness must, in fact, be a hole. I sensed something at the bottom. When I reached the far end of the circle, I broke through the opposite side of the curved, fiery barrier. And then I scooped the bawling girl off her mattress. She gasped as I lifted her up, which seemed a natural reaction to the situation at hand. The more I reflect on this day, however, the more I consider that she might have gasped at something else. Her eyes seemed to meet something in the doorway, and somehow, as if that moment in time were endless, I caught a reflection in one of her pupils. Her glossy, glassy eye revealed a momentary flicker of darkness, quickly replaced by the orange glow of flames.
Odette!
Diego roared as Gary attempted to douse the flames. However, as the liquid agent met the circle of fire, the inferno responded with a disapproving snarl, seeming to enlarge. The four of us gawped as the fire continued to resist Gary's equipment. I closed my eyes, slowing my breathing and ignoring the warmth of my skin. Direct contact with the flames had damaged my suit, but it would likely survive the return trip. I wasn't worried about that. I was worried about the girl in my arms who wore cotton pajamas. That left me with no other reasonable option. I lifted the small child as high as humanly possible, feeling my arm muscles strain and tear. In spite of my fitness training, I felt as if I'd stretched beyond my limits. It is remarkable, nevertheless, what a human can achieve in the name of survival. On uneven legs, I took powerful strides forwards, crossing through the threshold of fire into the blackened clearing. The girl shrieked as flames passed just beneath her elevated body. When I reached the blazing barrier at the other side of the circle, Gary and Diego immediately seized the girl from my arms, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I escaped from the ring. My skin was scorching, and I knew that I'd been seconds from earning burns. But I was alive. The girl was alive. We were all alive. And the adrenaline pumping through my veins had flushed out all of the unease I felt about the ring's black clearing, about the shape I'd seen in one of the girl's eyes. I thought only of the corpse I'd seen. That was all the trauma I felt able to bear. Still, I was grateful to safely exit that building with every firefighter and, other than Darius Havisham, every resident. I kept reminding myself of that blessing as fear seeped into every inch of my being, every crevice of my flesh. The goosebumps didn't flatten with ease, even when Diego and I spent our evening at the local drinking hole to flood our senses. I was hoping to drown any remaining vestige of adrenaline in my body. "Today was your toughest day," Diego said. "You did well, Odette. We saved everyone." Not Mr. Havisham," I whispered. He nodded somberly. "We did everything we could. We did a good thing, okay?" "It doesn't feel that way," I said. "Seeing his body was awful." "That's the most devastating aspect of this job," he replied. "You will see things that break your heart and your mind. But you're strong. You'll get through it. I promise." "Not as strong as you think," I sniffled. The man reached a hand across the table, clasping mine in a manner entirely unprofessional. But I didn't contest it. We'd built a bond over the months, and I had no qualms about that. Diego and I felt the same way about one another. However, I was a fraud. He didn't know every side of me. He didn't know the weak side, the sick side, the side that Grandpa had always warned might lurk beneath the sturdy exterior of my character. "You'll die alone." "What?" I gasped, eyeing Diego frightfully. The man frowned. "Sorry? Did I say something?" I opened my lips, about to respond, and then I realized he hadn't spoken. The voice had come from somewhere else. Somewhere within. Some intrusive, self-sabotaging thought from a distorted version of myself. The version that I had been suppressing for years, emerging with sharper clarity than ever before, as if woken from some lifelong slumber. A new version of Odette was born. Activated. "Tell yourself that, if it helps," I thought. "No, I cleared my throat. "Never mind, Diego, it's nothing. I just feel horrible after today. I don't feel right." Over the following days, my paranoia only worsened. The intrusive voice loudened, sounding so much like my own. That ever-present imposter. And it didn't take long for the strains of my relationship to show. Diego was a straightforward man, with a demeanour steady and unwavering, but he'd been transformed into someone unrecognisable. Someone just as unbalanced as me. And I only blamed myself. My sickness had become his sickness. My struggle had become his struggle. Watching me spiral into a well of despair had convinced Diego that the only rational recourse would be to dive after me. He realised, once we began to drown, that both of us were trapped, with no rope to hoist ourselves out. "You don't deserve him," I thought. "You and I just don't work," I mumbled. I'm not the person I tried to be. You need someone stronger." "That's stupid," Diego whispered absent-mindedly. "Stupid." "I shouldn't have ever worn that suit," I said. "This job isn't right for someone of my constitution. It's been days, and I'm still thinking about Darius Havisham." "That's normal, Odette," he assured me. "You saved that girl, Rebecca Harrington. She's alive because you ran through fire. You were made for this. You're just suffering from shock. It's horrible, but you'll get through it. We'll get through it." I shook my head. "Diego, it's changing you.
seeing me suffer like this. You're not equipped to tolerate me. And that's okay. It's okay. Please, let's just...
I don't want us to end, Odette, Diego firmly interrupted. I like you. Might even love you.
Look, suffering mentally isn't... It doesn't change how I feel about you.
I buckled. He had said all of the correct things, convincing me that he could handle my illness, convincing me that he could handle my instability. Or perhaps Diego had simply been telling the truth. Perhaps he had still seen me as strong, sturdy, reliable. Whatever the case, I didn't fully recognise the toll it was taking on him. I knew the man had changed, becoming fragile and jittery like me, but I didn't know just how deeply the darkness flowed. 1 week after the Havisham fire, Diego took a sick day. He said he needed to sleep, and I agreed. The man had spent days consoling me, whilst I endured sleepless nights. It had deprived him of rest too, and I'd already taken a few sick days, so he insisted that I should go to work whilst he would stay at home. "It'll be good for you," he smiled unconvincingly. "I'm fine, just tired. I'll be back tomorrow, okay? I'm sure it'll be a slow day for you today. Don't worry." I nodded, realising that I had to bite the bullet at some point. The sooner I returned to work, the better. By avoiding it, the very concept of that place was becoming frightening, and I refused to let this incident break me. Everything was happening as I'd expected, after all. I'd joined the fire department to push myself beyond my limits, conquer fear. It was some extreme form of exposure therapy. I wanted to push onwards. When I returned home around 5 in the afternoon, the apartment felt stale. Not just quiet, but silent. Not just still, but stuck. It didn't feel like home, and it didn't feel as if I were alone. "You're alone," I thought. Truthfully, it felt quite the opposite. Dread tinged my heart as I felt a nothingness watching me. An absence. Something that meant harm. "There's nothing, and you're coming undone," I thought.
Diego?
I called. There was no response, so I waded through the resistant air, passing from room to room in a bid to find him. When I entered the kitchen, I screamed. The oven door was ajar, and a red light blazed above it, permeating a thick, smoky mist. The fire alarm hadn't sounded, oddly, but I didn't fully process that until later. I was focusing on what hung out of the oven. Diego's body. It seemed apparent that he'd chosen this unthinkable fate, given that there was no sign of any struggle. But I collapsed, unable to accept that he would do this to himself. Not only that he would choose to end his life, but that he'd do so in such a dreadful way. He'd burnt his upper half to a crisp without any resistance, without pulling himself out of the oven. A slow, agonizing death. I don't know why any person would choose that, especially Diego. The man had struggled for the past week, but it wasn't right. He hadn't been suffering to this extent. It wasn't him. And that horrified me beyond words. Horrified me because it confirmed what I'd already been suspecting for days. Something was clinging to me. A darkness that had travelled beyond the burning apartment by gluing itself to the sole of my boot. As I left that circle of fire, I felt it. The weight that left with me. The shape that had watched me from some hidden place. It was still watching me. A thing that I didn't see, perhaps couldn't see. I finally accepted that my childhood had been no lie. Grandpa's story had been real, though I had long convinced myself otherwise. Long convinced myself that he hadn't ever told the story at all, in fact. Unfortunately, it was all happening exactly as he promised. First, I disturbed the ring, inviting Paskuda to follow. Then, I suffered loss, weakening my spirit. I feared the third step, and I needed to see the one person who might be able to save me from it. Save me from ending up like him.
What are you doing here?
I asked. My brother stood in the doorway to my grandfather's home, wearing a smug grin. Me? Anthony scoffed. I always visit Grandpa on Sundays. You barely ever see him anymore. Thought you two had fallen out. I sighed.
It's complicated. How has he been since,
Christmas? 5 months ago? Anthony smiled. Sorry, I'm being cruel. It's fine, Odette. He doesn't remember things anymore. Not properly, anyway. He doesn't remember whether you visit him or not, and he definitely doesn't remember whether it's been 5 days or 5 months. He doesn't care.
Do you?
I asked weakly.
Of course not, Odette. I just worry about you,
my brother said, lunging forwards to embrace me.
You've been quiet since, last week. Since the fire. How have you been? Oh, I
started, before bursting into tears. I had told my family about the fire, but the loss of Diego was something I'd barely been able to explain to myself. The words came tumbling out in a jumble.
Oh, Dad!
My brother hoarsely started.
I'm so sorry. Oh, that's awful. I only met him a few times, but he seemed like a good man. Seemed good for you, I mean. Sorry, that doesn't help. I don't know what to say. I didn't realise he had been suffering. Never mind. I'm sorry. Not that it helps to hear that, but I am. Thanks, Tony, I sniffled, hugging my brother again. Sorry for not talking this week. How's Mum? How's Dad?
Anthony shrugged.
Still arguing about what to do with Grandpa. They don't agree with me. About what? I asked.
That it's time to move him into the home. I nodded.
He was awful at Christmas. Didn't say a word to me.
That's a good thing at this point. When he does say something, it's often nonsensical screaming or that same question. Where am I? Anthony said. So don't take his silence personally, Odette. It's his way of trying to keep things pleasant. That's what I tell myself, anyway. Actually, we talked about you earlier. I lifted an eyebrow.
Really?
As if answering, the floorboards creaked above our heads. My brother and I shut our eyes upwards.
He's awake,
Anthony noted. How about I make us some dinner? We should all watch something together.
First, I want to know what Grandpa said about me,
I answered meekly.
Oh, vain, aren't you?
My brother teased, chuckling.
He only said the most wonderful things, my darling sister. talked about how you were his favourite grandchild, the cream of the crop, the... Tony, I sighed sharply. Okay, my brother smiled. He, asked me about your training at the fire department. He must have remembered that from a few years ago. Anyway, I told him that you were a qualified firefighter. I did accidentally reveal that you responded to last week's big fire. He was quite uncomfortable then. Said he worried about you because you were frail. Oh, and what did you say to that? I asked. My brother smirked. I laughed and called him a misogynistic pig. But Grandpa claimed it had nothing to do with that. Oh no. He said he just wanted you to be happy, and he knew you weren't. He was worried that you'd found what he found? Not sure what he meant. Still, it was nice to get anything lucid out of him. Sorry you missed it. My chest pounded as I untangled everything my brother said. Grandpa already knew I'd broken the ring, doing exactly what he'd always warned me not to do. But it had to be done. I had to save the girl's life, even at the expense of my own. I wouldn't have been able to live with the alternative. There was no other way. I had to believe that, or I'd lose what little sanity I had left. "Oh, Dad!" called Grandpa huskily. The voice was more feeble than I remembered, as if my grandfather had been weathered by 5 years, not 5 months. "She's here, Grandpa!" my brother yelled. "I'll make some dinner, and you two catch up, okay?" Our grandfather said nothing in response. There came only the sound of floorboards groaning, then a door creaking. "Sounds like he's gone back to his room," Anthony said. "Go and keep him company, Odette, and I'll cook a curry for the 3 of us. I want to make sure he eats something before I head home. Sound good?" "I don't know," I began, but my brother had already slipped into the kitchen, and I was left in the living room, wondering what frightened me. Paskuda, of course, but not only that. "You care only about yourself," I thought. I feared the conversation I was about to have with my grandfather. I'd chosen to visit him, chosen to talk to him about what was happening, but upon being faced with that very prospect, I was petrified. Still, I took steady steps upstairs, closing my eyes and attuning to the sound of water boiling in the kitchen, reminding myself that everything was grounded in reality. Anthony was cooking dinner for his sister and his grandfather. We were about to have a lovely evening. I would tell Grandpa about the awful things that had happened to me, and he would tell me that grief had caused my paranoia. I had just seen my boyfriend's corpse. It seemed natural that my mind would be disjointed. Yes, there is a rational explanation for all things, I thought, as a shadow danced across the landing. When I reached the upstairs corridor, I looked towards Grandpa's room. The door was open, allowing light to spill into the hallway. I crept towards it, then gently pushed my way into the room. My grandfather was sitting on the very edge of the bed. His eyes were locked onto the carpet. A man on a ledge, enchanted by the call of the abyss. He wasn't sitting on the ledge of a tall structure, but his eyes said otherwise. It wasn't long before I realised that he was seeing something I didn't see. "You're just unwell," I thought. For a second, however, I was certain I'd seen a nodding shadow beyond the window pane. My skin became clammy with fear as my grip on reality loosened. "Grandpa?" I choked. The man's head did not shoot towards me, and his eyes remained absent, removed from reality by whatever they'd seen within the floor of the room. Yet he heard me, noticed me. "You broke the circle," he eventually hissed. My skin tightened and my blood froze. He knew. There was no denying it any longer, though I'd known the truth for some time. Known as soon as I first broke that cursed circle of flames, when I locked my eyes upon the black abyss that harboured some abhorrent nothingness below. Nothing can be something, Grandpa smiled, reading my thoughts. I howled in dread. I had to save a child, I shakily insisted. "It doesn't matter," my grandfather whispered. "Paskuda has you." I started to sob near silently. I lost someone. Diego. I loved him and I won't ever be the same again, Grandpa. When will the pain end? "Pain?" the man breathlessly replied, finally locking his eyes onto mine. "Do you think you've felt pain?" I gulped. "Yes. First you invite it. Then you experience loss. Then you see it." "Yes," my grandfather nodded. "And only then do you understand. Only then do you suffer." You haven't spoken about Paskuda in years," I said. "I almost thought I'd imagined it." "Why would that make it any less real, Odette?" Grandpa smiled. The man suddenly rose to his feet, more nimbly than I'd seen him move in my 24 years of life. And everything became clear. All of the things that I hadn't wanted to see for years. "No," I whimpered. "It needs us, Odette," he calmly responded. The man was neither happy nor sad, neither kind nor menacing. He wasn't anything at all. "I've tried for so long," I whispered, backing away. I've tried to pretend. I fought it. I really fought it." "Paskuda was always there," Grandpa whispered, "waiting for you to let it inside." And then he confirmed what I'd known since we left Poland. As his flesh twisted and tensed, a wave of throbbing, tumorous lumps appeared. The man transformed into something less than human. Well, it was no transformation. It was a revelation. That was not Grandpa. It hadn't been Grandpa since I'd been a little girl. That man died in Poland, and we brought something else with us. What moved before me was nothing but loose flesh, covering something that was nothing at all. Nothing that had any place in our world, at least. Rotten flesh concealed a thing that did not need to be concealed, for it could not be seen by human eyes. A thing that sought to torment its sufferers by wearing a mask that was terrifyingly tangible. Something diseased and reflective. What haunts me most is that I know what hides beneath. The nothingness that I felt in the blackened circle. The absence that had really been something all along. As a gnarled hand launched towards me, I finally willed my body to do what my mind had been begging it to do. I turned and ran towards the door. But those fingernails, serving as discoloured gloves for some ethereal appendage, dug into my arm. each nail scooped out a creamy sliver of my skin, drawing blood and possibly leaving something behind, threatening to condemn me to the same awful end as Grandpa. Clutching my bloody wound, I managed to make it through the doorway and sprint across the landing. As I barreled down the stairs, feeling the walls of the house bend and splinter, I started to wonder whether reality had ever been real at all, whether I had ever been real at all. There was that voice in my mind. It had become so insidious that it no longer really spoke at all. It was part of my mind, part of me. I realised that my existential questions didn't matter. It didn't matter whether this had always been the deterioration of an ill mind or ill minds. Why would that make it any less real, Odette? Fear had made Paskuda real. Real enough to hurt me, I realised, as I supported my bloody, pulsating limb. And if I wanted to avoid Grandpa's fate, I had to flee. I didn't utter a word to my brother. I seized his arm and began to pull him towards the back door. He followed me through the garden, out of the gate and down the road to my car. Anthony did not resist. You might wonder why, but I don't. My brother looked over my shoulder and I caught his eye as he did. I didn't have to ask him what he saw. I knew that he understood, in a split second, what I'd witnessed, why we had to leave. And though I tried not to see the reflection in his pupil, time and space defied all rhyme and reason once more. Reality slowed to a crawl. My gaze moved of its own accord, and I saw Paskuda in Tony's eye. Bulging, an ever-enlarging, cancerous growth that hardly had the appearance of my grandfather any longer. I have spent the last month living in fear, not fearing the fleshy, tumour-ridden mask that Paskuda wears. It is a haunting image, but not the primary nightmare which persists in my mind. I fear the invisible thing. I fear that Paskuda has found its way beneath my skin, that it might rid the world of me, too.